Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to talk about all of the books that I was able to read in January of 2026. It was a long month, as January always is, and I got to a lot of really good ones this month. So let's dive in. I started the month by reading Invisible ADHD. This is a new book by Shanna Pearson, who is an ADHD coach who's pretty well known. She does a lot of media appearances. And this is a book that is about very practical tips for people who have ADHD, and I would say particularly for women. And what I would mention about this book is this is a very high energy author, and she reads the audio for this book. And it almost turned me away because she's very emphatic in her reading style. I had to kind of get used to it. I had to ease into it. But I really did like all of the practical tips in this book and the way that the author really breaks things down. And she repeats important information, which I also thought was really a helpful component of the audiobook as well. Next, I read Be the Unicorn. This is by William Vanderbloemen, and I had read a different book by this author last month and decided to pick up this book because I already owned it. And it's basically about different habits that separate leaders from good leaders from less effective leaders. And I liked this book. I thought it was interesting. I liked the other book that I read by him, I think, better. This book was actually kind of like a prequel to the book that I read last month, and it introduced some of the concepts from that book. And I liked that the second book, which is actually the first book of his that I read, goes into a lot more depth. And so I enjoyed that other one a little bit more. Then I read a book called Fawning. This is by Ingrid Clayton. And this is a book that I was expecting to have the author be a little more distanced. She is a therapist, she's a trained therapist. And this is about the concept of if you're familiar with freeze or fight or flight, there is a fourth category now of how you respond to, stressful situations, which is to fawn. And she's basically talking about this concept, but in the way that she's talking about this concept, it had a lot to do with her own personal story. And it turns out this is an author who's written another memoir about trauma that she has experienced earlier in her life. And it's part of kind of how she works with clients. And I thought that was interesting, but I kind of thought this was going to be a book that was more objective, and it ends up that it's kind of tied in with her memoir and personal story, which I thought was fine. It's just not what I was expecting. I did take away some really interesting concepts, about how this works. But the other thing that I thought was really interesting is fawning is typically represented, at least in this book, as a more negative thing, which I was thinking there might be a more neutral way to talk about it. I don't know. So it was one that gave me some things to chew on, but I think that I would want to read more about this concept. I didn't feel I got a full kind of neutral overview of it from this particular book. All right, next I picked up Joy for Beginners by Erica Bauermeister. This was one of my TBR card books from the previous month. I was supposed to read a book on female friendship. I quickly realized I have already read this book, so I actually picked out a second book on female friendship, which I will get to a little bit later in the video. But this is basically about a group of women friends that are kind of supporting each other through kind of some difficult, challenging things that they're experiencing at midlife. And I liked the book. I think the first time I read it, I was kind of 3 stars, out of 5. And I was pretty much in the same place when I reread it and revisited this book. All right, next I picked up Awake by Jen Hatmaker. And this is a memoir about a woman who is fairly well known, apparently, within the evangelical Christian community. I did not know who this person was. And I think her partner, her former partner, is a pastor. And she finds out in this memoir and kind of talks about the aftermath that her partner of 20 years had an affair. And so she learns of this affair, and it kind of blows up her family. And she talks about kind of how people came around her and what eventually happens, in her life because of the situation. And I thought this was incredibly well done. It's also read by the author in the audio, and she gives some asides and extra stories and things like that in the audio, which was really interesting as well. All right, next I read actually 3 books in a series by Claire McIntosh. This is a trilogy about a female detective working through a number of different crimes throughout the series. The first book is called The Last Party. The second book is called A Game of Lies. And then the third book is called Other People's Houses. And I actually basically read these one right after the other. I got started with the first one, which has this fun twist that happens, I would say maybe 75% of the way through the book. And it's tied to the female detective. You kind of like learn something about her background that's really interesting. And basically, the first book is about a man who is killed, and we come to find out that she knows this man and had kind of like a relationship with him. And so she's trying to kind of like hide that, you know, as part of what's happening in this book. The second book in the series, A Game of Lies, is about a bunch of people who are on like a reality television show, and somebody is killed, and then she kind of gets, you know, she arrives to kind of investigate the crime. And in book one, she starts to have kind of a relationship with another detective, and he shows up in book two, and so their relationship is kind of evolving. And then in book three, we start to see kind of the resolution of what is happening with their relationship, because it gets a little bit bumpy for a number of different reasons. And basically, they're each working on a crime in book three, and then we find out that those crimes are interconnected. So this was a really smartly written like trilogy. I would absolutely pick up other books by this author. I think I've actually read this author before. I wasn't sure that I had, but there's at least a couple other books in her backlist that look familiar to me. So I think I have read that author before. Okay, next up I read The Accomplished by Lisa Lutz, and this is a book about two people who meet like when they're in college, a man and a woman, and they have this really close relationship, but it's not really a romance, and everybody's kind of wondering like, why isn't it a romance? And then somebody that is connected to both of them is killed, and they both get kind of called in by the police to talk about the situation, and we get a lot of the backstory of their relationship and as it's kind of moving forward. This is a book that's like very twisty, and like based on the description, it's typically something that I would like, but I found myself, I think it was just like a little bit long, or it could have been edited down. Like by the end of it, I was kind of just a little bit bored. I was working my way through it on audio. So I think that if you like kind of like twisty, very character driven narratives, might be one to pick up. I don't know that I would pick up another book by this author or not. It would probably have to depend a little bit on the plot. All right, next up I read Obsidian by Jennifer Armentrout. This was another one on my TBR card. I think I had to read a book with like one word in the title. And this is a YA book about a teenage girl who finds out that her next door neighbor, who happens to be an attractive teenage boy, is actually an alien. And this is a book that it was cute. It was fun. I don't think I need to read more in this series, but I could definitely see, it reminded me a little bit of kind of the Twilight craze and like what people were trying to emulate around that time. And so that, you know, if you're interested in kind of like the vibe that came from Twilight, you might pick this one up. All right, next I picked up a book called Euro Dreams by Kate Stewart. And I had talked about in my previous video, I was giving this author another try because her books have been kind of two different components for me. One, there was a holiday romance that she wrote that had like really fun elements. I really enjoyed it. And then she had these like dark romances that I was like not as interested in. And this book I thought was going to be more like the holiday romance, just based on the description. It's about a doctor who is from the UK. He travels back there to give like a lecture or something like that. And there's a nurse who goes with him. She's had kind of a crush on him. And basically they end up like having crushes on each other. It's a little bit of like an enemies to lovers subplot or kind of trope of this particular book. But I found myself like not rooting for either one of them. Like I just didn't enjoy them as characters. Like I didn't enjoy the female character. I didn't enjoy the male character. And then they got together and it wasn't any better. And I was kind of struggling to get through this one. And I also felt like they were kind of like just very immature in how they were engaging with each other in this book, despite the fact that they were like well into adulthood, had had multiple relationships in the past. And so, I mean, it ends with kind of like a nice closure, but I was kind of disappointed by this one. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do with this author. If I'm going to continue trying to read, I may not, given the different experiences that I've already had. All right, next up I read Gus. This is the second book in the Bright Side series by Kim Holden. I read the first book probably several months back. And the first book has a bit of a tragedy that happens. I won't go into detail in case it's a spoiler. But the second book picks up with this male character who had kind of experienced this tragedy. He's in a band. He's like the lead singer in a band. And he is like completely traumatized by this thing that has happened and is like basically spiraling, like just doing a lot of drugs and like, you know, not making great choices. And so his manager hires him like an assistant to try to like get him back on the straight and narrow. And he starts to kind of fall for this woman who is his assistant. And eventually she ends up like working for his mother in like this interesting twist of events that happens. And that adds like a really cute component to this because she starts to kind of be involved in his life when he's not traveling with this band. I really like this one. I feel like a reformed bad boy is always kind of a fun story. And I'm definitely going to pick up the third book in this series. All right, another book I picked up is called This Book is a Retreat. This is by Marian Richmond. And this is a book that just looked interesting to me. It's kind of a journaling book. Like it has a different question on every page that is meant to kind of help you do some like self reflection and introspection. And I love books like that. I'm a dedicated journaler. I journal every day. And so this was one that I thought looked kind of interesting, and it's really beautiful as well. It'd be a great gift book if you know someone who'd be kind of interested in that kind of thing. All right, next up I read The Puma Years, which is a memoir by Laura Coleman. This is a book that was another TBR card. I had to pick a book with an animal in the title. And it is about a woman who goes and works at like an animal sanctuary in, I think it's South America. And she gets very connected to this puma. And I would say like, I could see this book being really interesting to people who enjoy like travel memoirs. I wouldn't say it's adventure. I mean, there's like elements of adventure in it, but that's not kind of like the whole purpose of the memoir. It's a little bit of like a coming of age because of the nature of this book. I will say I was not completely sucked in. I think that, you know, if you are interested in animal sanctuaries or in, you know, travel in foreign countries or coming of age of women in their kind of like mid-20s, you know, all of those things might be reasons to pick up this book. But it's not necessarily one that I think will stick out for me in the future. All right, next up, I picked up The Good Enough Job by Simone Stalzoff. If you've been watching these videos for a while, you know I love to read books on career, and this is basically that. This book is basically talking about how there have been kind of like cultural messages that we've been given about how we should be engaging in work, and how the author kind of breaks down those cultural messages and says like, these are not necessarily true in terms of how you should be thinking about your job. And you can actually come to your job in like a little bit more of like an objective way or a scientific way to think about like, is it meeting the needs of what you need it to meet without it necessarily being kind of like a more romantic understanding of work. And I thought that was really interesting. So I enjoyed that one. Next up, I picked up the first couple of books in the Heated Rivalry series, also called Game Changers, but this is the new show called Heated Rivalry that everyone is talking about. And the first book is Game Changer. The second book is Heated Rivalry by Rachel Reed. And these are books. The first book, Game Changer, is about a professional hockey player who begins to have a relationship, kind of a closeted gay relationship with the man who makes his smoothies in the morning. And he has a crush on this guy, and they end up starting to have a relationship. And I would say the main kind of trope of this is like, will he or won't he come out of the closet? That's something that is kind of happening in this first book. The second book is about two men who are also professional hockey players, connected to the hockey player in the first book, and they are rivals on different teams, and they're kind of like famously known for being rivals, and then they happen to start having a secret relationship with each other, a secret romance. And the second book, Heated Rivalry, is what the show is based on in the first season. Now, I really thought these were interesting. I will say I like the second book better. I can totally understand why the TV show starts with the second book. It has kind of a back and forth where you see the origin of this relationship between these two men and then how it has developed over time, because they only see each other like every few months when they're in the same city, and they're having these encounters and starting to like fall deeper and deeper in love with each other. So I really like this enough that I would continue to read other books in the series. All right, next I picked up Gone to Dust. This is by Matt Goldman. It is a mystery novel about a crime where the body is found with a bunch of dust from like vacuum cleaner bags. And so this like messes with all the DNA in the scene. And this was kind of fun. I like this. I felt like it was a little bit like a noir feel, where you have this kind of like hard-edged detective, and he's like trying to figure out what's going on. And I liked the like red herrings that were kind of put in throughout this mystery. I did listen to this one on audio, and I think I listened to it in like one sitting. It was an interesting one. All right, next up I picked up The Letters by Suzanne Woods Fisher. This is the first book, I believe, in a series. Let me check that. I'm not sure if it's a standalone or a first book. Yeah, first book in a series called In at Eagle Hill. And this is basically about a woman who is Amish. She is a widow. She's got a few kids. And she's trying to figure out basically how to make a livelihood for herself. And so she decides to turn her home into an inn. And there are various people who kind of come to this inn, one being a woman who is kind of struggling in her own marriage and ends up coming and visiting with this family. And the woman who owns the inn is also starting to have like a little bit of a relationship, the widow, with this neighbor who is Amish as well. And then there's a couple teenagers in the home that we get some kind of side narratives about also. And I actually really like this author a lot. She has some different series that I've started to kind of poke around in, and I'll probably continue to read other books in this series. All right, then I picked up a book called I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman. I believe this is a book that got published several decades ago and then just got like picked up again and revived. It is a feminist dystopian novel about a bunch of women who are basically held underground, and we are unclear why. And then something happens and basically like they are able to escape. And so this is told from the perspective of one of these women who is kind of escaping the situation. It is dark, it is dystopian. But I also there are other people I've seen who've kind of reviewed this book recently, and they were just like completely blown away by it. I think that it's a kind of in the vein of like The Yellow Wallpaper, or like other, if you've read Charlotte Perkins Gilman, like she has some kind of like feminist utopian books and things like that. This is obviously kind of the opposite side of that, but if you're familiar with that literature base, this would fit kind of right within that. So I'm glad I read it. It was not something that I kind of knew what to expect, but I really enjoyed that one. All right, next I picked up a book called Hearts in Circulation by Sarah Monzon. I had read the first book in this series. It is basically about a bunch of librarians who are having romances. And in this second book, there is a woman who is driving a library van, and she breaks down in this small town, and then there's a rock slide and she can't leave, and she has to basically be the guest in the house of the mechanic who lives in the town, who happens to be this like burly man, and of course they have a romance. One of the factors of this book that I liked is the man has kind of these sensory sensitivities, and so she's having to kind of like navigate that with him as they're beginning to have a relationship. And it's just a very sweet romance. Will absolutely pick up the third book in the series that I think is coming out this spring. All right, next I read Toni at Random. This is by Dana Williams and is kind of like a biography of Toni Morrison, who is a very well-known novelist, and her time editing at Random House, which I knew that Toni Morrison was an editor at Random House, but I didn't really know all the things that she had worked on. And basically she was iconic. I mean, like there are so many things that this book talks about that she was involved in kind of bringing to the public, especially in terms of like Black womanist literature and like various other things that were happening at the time. And fascinating. This took me back to, I happen to have a couple graduate degrees in women, gender, and sexuality studies. And so I'm kind of familiar with a lot of literature that was coming out at the time that she was at Random House. And I like the backstories on some of this stuff and how she developed relationships with some of these authors, both men and women that she worked with, and what they were trying to do to kind of like bring more Black literature to the public through various strategies that they were creating. I found the whole thing just really interesting. So I'm super glad I picked this up. Somebody I know was reading it and kind of recommended it, and I thought it was just really, really interesting. Okay, also this month I read all 3 books in the Crescent City series by Sarah J. Maas. And a couple of years back, I read the Throne of Glass series in January, and it was like how I got myself through like the dark, long month of January. And so this year I decided to assign myself Crescent City series. And I had read the first book before, but it was like early in my days of reading fantasy, and I like didn't know what world building was. I couldn't follow it. I really struggled with the plot. And so after reading a ton of different other fantasy series, I thought, let me dive back into this and see what I think. I loved this. I would absolutely read this over and over again. This is true of basically everything I've read by Sarah J. Maas. I have now read all 3 of her series, all the books that are currently out. She is still publishing books, which I know people are very excited about. She just finished some more that I think are, I don't know when they're coming out, but everybody's kind of like waiting on the edge of their seats for this. And Crescent City is basically about this girl who I would say she's in her like her 20s, and she is half human, half fae, and she's best friends with this woman who's like a wolf and human like mix. And early in the book, I don't think this is a spoiler, a group of her friends who are all wolves are murdered. And she's trying to figure out what happened. She's trying to figure out why. And the root of this entire series is basically that event. And the best friend like pops up like throughout this series in different ways, despite the fact that she is dead. But there's like backstory that we learn about this whole situation. And there is a male main character who is like investigating this murder, and he begins to eventually have a relationship with this female main character who's half human, half fae. The world building made way more sense to me second time around. I think partially because I'd kind of like learned what it meant to have world building in fantasy novels, so like it was a lot easier for me to understand. And I actually loved that like the second book and the third book just continue the same story of like what is happening with this couple, what is happening with all the people around them. The complexity gets added on throughout the different books. I believe that there's at least one more book in this series because of just the nature of the different like factions that are happening in this particular world. And the way that the third book ends, I can kind of assume that there's going to be more. What I will say is what surprised me, I was not expecting this, and I probably read this somewhere and just completely forgot about it. The second book ends and it merges with another one of her series, and like characters from another series are like in the end of the second book. And I was like, oh, like I was not expecting that. So the third book in this series has all of this crossover with a bunch of other characters from one of her other series, which of course I have read and like totally understood what was going on there. And I thought that was like super interesting. Now, I recently read a book where there was a crossover between two series of the same author, and I didn't like how it was done. I was like, it was jarring. It was like, it didn't make sense to me. And in this case, I thought it was great. Like, it was super fun to see both of these series come together, and it just makes me really excited to see what other things she's going to publish. So I was thinking as I finished the third book, like if I was asked like on a desert island, if there was like one author that you would want to read, it would probably be someone like Sarah J Maas, because I feel like you could just continue to read her series. There's a lot of depth to them. There's a lot of complicated components of the plot that you're just going to get more and more details the more you read these series. So I would absolutely read this series again. I will say each of the books is roughly 800 pages long, so it is an investment. I listened to it on audio and was also kind of like reading it. I have it in hard copy, ebook, and audio. So I was kind of switching back and forth based on what I was able to do, and would highly recommend the audio for these as well. All right. Then I read a book called Powered by Projects. This is by Antonio Nieto Rodriguez. This author is well known for talking about project management in things like Harvard Business Review. He is like an internationally known guy in the field. And I loved this book. I ended up reviewing it on LinkedIn, and I posted about my review and like tagged this author because I just found his work to be really interesting. This was a NetGalley book that I got, and I read it like just a couple days after the book came out. It came out January of 26. And really what he is arguing is like modern organizations and businesses are no longer kind of functioning just based on their operations. They are functioning based on projects and kind of initiatives that are happening. And so you should be organizing your organization around this concept of projects and how do you support projects. Now, within my organization, this is not a higher ed book, but I could apply it to higher ed. Within my organization, I actually lead a team that does institution-wide projects. This is kind of like what my work is, which is why I found this so interesting. And I just really liked it. I thought it was smart. I thought it was right on. There was like very little in this book that I disagreed with. And I look forward to reading more of his work in the future. All right, I also read a NetGalley book as well, The New Perimenopause. This is by Mary Claire Haver. And this author is also known for The New Menopause. She is an OBGYN who is writing about these phenomena that are happening in women's lives. And I would say that there is elements of this book that are really kind of shocking in terms of like how little research and research dollars are going to women's health. She like is very clear about kind of her stance on that. And also, you know, like there are things that we know about perimenopause and menopause that are not necessarily making it into clinicians' offices in terms of how these things are treated directly for women. So she's doing a lot of like myth busting in this book, which I thought was really interesting. And I really like this. I think it has like a really nice kind of scientific foundation underneath it. And she also shares, you know, different narratives and stories from women who are experiencing perimenopause to kind of like round out the book as well. All right, so I mentioned I had picked out a second women's friendship book based on the book that I had already read, The Joy for Beginners. And the second book I picked out is called Willa's Grove by Laura Munson. This is basically about a woman who is living in Montana. She has a partner who dies and she's still kind of grieving him. And she actually like owns the town that she lives in. It's like a very small town and she has like an inn and a couple other like businesses there. And she's trying to sell the town. And so she has these three women come and visit her who are friends. And it's kind of like a last hurrah before she's trying to sell the town. And all of these women are in situations where they're kind of at a crossroads in their lives. And so they're all coming together to kind of like figure out what to do and to kind of share their stories and connect and have these friendships. I like this. I thought it was interesting. I like each of the women had really interesting backstories, and I think it would be kind of like a good book club book if that is of interest to you. All right, then I picked up Best Offer Wins. This is by Marissa Cashino. And this is a book that is about this woman who basically falls in love with this house and feels like she needs to buy this house that is going on the market. And she's trying to get the sellers to offer it to her before it goes on the market. So she's trying to like preempt the market with this house. And she basically does a bunch of bonkers stuff that's like really borderline in terms of like stalking and like other kinds of things. And it's one of those books that you're just kind of like watching a car crash happen. Like it's just, you know, this is not going to end well. And I found it to be actually like really fast paced and I enjoyed this one. I would definitely pick up something else by this author. All right, then I read The Botanist Assistant. This is by Peggy Townsend. And I am not sure, let me check and see if this is part of a series. I think this might be a standalone, but I wouldn't be surprised if this was also a book that eventually has more series books added to it. This is about a woman who is in her mid-50s. She works at a university as a botanist assistant, and she is coded as autistic in the book. I don't think it is named that. But basically, her boss dies or is killed, and she gets kind of pulled into the investigation of what happened. And there's like a groundskeeper or some other person, like a guy who works in the lab or something, who's kind of helping her, you know, with this situation. And she's just incredibly charming. I listened to this on audio, really enjoyed it. And I do like mysteries that are set in academic settings. And this one was no different. Next up, I picked up Hamnet. This is by Maggie O'Farrell. And this is recently made into a feature film. Which is partly why I wanted to pick it up in case I want to watch the movie. And it is the story of Shakespeare and his family, including his son, who in this book dies. And it is about grief. It is about the marriage of Shakespeare with his wife. It is about his wife's background because she is seen as, she has kind of like a, almost not a medical background, but kind of like an informal medical background where people come to her for like healing and things like that. And so that's an element of this book. This book was a 5-star read for me. It is and purely based on how it is structured and how it is written. There's kind of this back and forth in the narrative, especially in the first part of the book, and it kind of shifts a little bit later on, that is very creatively done. And it's an incredible book, literary fiction. And if any of that sounds interesting, I would definitely pick it up. Absolutely a trigger warning for death of a child. So if that's something that you stay away from, this would not be a book for you to pick up. Okay, then I read a book called Haven't Killed in Years. This is by Amy Green, and this is a book about a woman who is the daughter of a serial killer who, when she was a child, she was like there when her father was killing people and she was exposed to this situation. Her mother was also put in prison. Her father was put in prison. And then she basically went into like almost like witness protection. Like she has taken on a different identity. People are not supposed to know, you know, who she is or who she's connected to. And then somebody basically contacts her and knows who she is. And so she's trying to figure out how this person knows and what they're trying to do. This one was creative. I like this. I don't think I've read anything by this author before. And I don't even know, just looking to see what else this author has done. There's at least one other book in their backlist from like 5 years ago. So I would consider picking up other books by this author. I thought this one was creatively done. All right, then I read The 12-Week Year for Writers. This is by a couple of people. It is co-written, I think, by Brian Moran and Michael Lennington, who wrote the original 12-Week Year book. And then this is co-written with Trevor Thrall, who is adding in the part about the writers. And so the concept of the 12-week year is basically about quarterly planning. And I enjoyed the first book a lot. This book is basically saying, if you are a writer, how do you apply the 12-week year to your writing schedule? And the guy who writes this is an academic, so he's talking about academic writing, but you could obviously apply it to all kinds of writing. And he is basically saying this is what allowed him to get his writing done. And so he really believes in this process, and he contacted the author who he happens to know and said, can I write a book about writing based on your structure, basically. And I like this. I think it is very practical. If you are like newer to academic writing, if you're like a graduate student or like a pre-tenure faculty member, like this would definitely be one to consider checking out. All right, next I picked up, actually the last book of the month that I read is The Birdwatcher by Jacqueline Michard. And this is an author who is most well known for, I think it's called, is it The Deep End of the Ocean? Let me look really quickly. Yeah, she's most well known for The Deep End of the Ocean, which is basically a book that is part of a series about a young boy who is kidnapped and the family actually eventually found alive, and how he kind of comes back to his family. And I have read that book, enjoyed that book. This is a book about a woman who is I think she's a journalist, and there's a graduate student who happens to be an escort who is arrested for murder, and she knows this, these two women know each other. And so the journalist is trying to like investigate what happened and to use her connections to this woman's past to kind of like uncover what was going on. The thing that I would say I like the best about this book is every chapter starts with a description of a bird and kind of like ties in this bird watcher theme kind of like thematically with what's going on. And I thought that was kind of like a really interesting way of doing this. I did listen to this on audio, and I kind of wonder if it would have been better if I had not listened to it on audio, because I think it's more of a literary fiction book that you could probably take your time with it and maybe enjoy it more. I am noticing that like it's not rated super high. I think it's a little over 3 stars, which tells me that people were kind of a little ho-hum about it. And I kind of fell into that camp as well. I thought it was creative, but I would say I actually liked The Deep End of the Ocean better, which was one of the very early books that this author is known for. All right, those are all the books that I read in January of 2026. Some really good ones in there. And I am absolutely looking forward to all of the books I'm going to pick up in February as well. You can check out my February TBR video, which will be posted soon. And until the next video, happy reading.